And then at the end of the afternoon, we'll have a Q&A for the other four. So.
Okay, thank you again. Sorry for the interruption. As I was saying, this is a paper which is taken from a broader project, so it has a theoretical framework which tries to see how the European Union has been reframing borders after the refugee crisis of 2015. And my specific case is on Italy and then the contribution of Italy in this reframing process of the borders of the European Union. So why Italy? Italy is a fundamental country in this process, in particular when we are talking about migration. Of course, it is part of the European southern border, and so there is a geographical component which makes it all the more important when we talk about bordering efforts. And so to a certain extent, it is called to implement the European Union legislation on borders. On the other hand, and precisely because of its geographical position, Italy has a specific say on what the European Union does and what the European Union frames as borders. So it was very interesting for us to see how Italy has been contributing to this specific process. So why the question of rebordering? Why the European Union has been caught in rebordering process? The refugee crisis was indeed a fundamental watershed in terms of migration and asylum policy for the European Union. And all of a sudden, there was a very tense moment, and in particular, an internal crisis in the European Union. Some of the borders within the European Union have been reintroduced, as you know, at the late 2015 and beginning of 2016. And to say the truth, they are still there. And that has created a kind of ontological insecurity for the European Union. And the same has happened also for Italy. The refugee crisis has been an important moment when Italy has kind of testified the positioning that it had within the European Union landscape, as well as the capacity that it was able to develop in terms of migration and asylum. Moreover, Italy has been caught in many crises over the last years, in particular, the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, the refugee crisis of 2015, and last but not least, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which has hit Italy first very hard. So when we have these crisis moments, of course, security is being questioned, and what we are searching for is a specific definition of what security is, what is supporting security, which are the fundamental values that are underpinning our definition of security. And this is why in the paper that I have written, there is the search for security narratives, security definitions that Italy has been providing over the last years, starting from the refugee crisis, and trying to see how these kind of narratives of security have contributed to this rebordering process. When we think about border, we do not have to overlap borders with fences or walls. This could be part of the discourse, but it is not its entirety. Borders can be many things. They can be administrative borders, they can be cognitive borders, they can be boundaries. So ways of separation which are not hard, but can be also very fluid, not visible, but yet with very important implications. So the observation period was 2015, 2021. The political environment in Italy has been very variegated, and it is very peculiar of Italy. And we had 3 governments which have succeeded. The first one was a center-right, center-left coalition, and the Minister of the Interior at the time was Minister Marco Minniti. That was a period with very high flows towards Italy, and in particular 2016 was a very tense period, as we will see later on. Then we had the first full populist government in Western Europe, which was composed by the Five Stars movement and the Lega, which is quite an anti-migration party in Italy. And the Minister for the Interior was taken by Matteo Salvini. That period was not a period of very high flows. In fact, flows were rather low with respect to the previous years, but still migration was very salient as an issue. And then we had a center-left, center plus movement Five Stars movement, with Minister for the Interior has in the person of Luciana Lamorgese, which is a technician with a long experience in the Minister for the Interior. And that was again a period of increasing inflows towards the European Union. So what I discovered in the paper and my work for the entire project at large was that there were 3 main narratives, 3 main discourses that Italy has contributed in this reframing exercise of the European Union, this bordering exercise of the European Union. So the first prominent and consistent narrative, and when I'm saying consistent, I mean that this kind of narrative was present in all the 3 governments that I have examined. So there was not a discontinuity with respect to this specific argument that was made. So the first one is that Italy's southern border matches the borders of the European Union. So there is a kind of overlap here that has to be taken into account. The second one is that Italy wants the European Union to stretch the border out towards Africa. And the second one was that what we define as borders is somehow fundamental to define what is the national community internally, which are the main values, which are the main underpinnings that somehow make up for Italy as a political actor. So let's see the different narrations that have been taken forward by the 3 governments. And let's see how they have differentiated among the political colors, which nuances have been emphasized, and which peculiarities they have undertaken. So the first one, the very prominent argument that Italy has made is that Italy's border is also the border of the European Union. So to a certain extent, and looking at this definition as it is, it may seem that we are referring to an external audience, and we are trying to convince that there is limits that cannot be surpassed, that somehow separate what is secure, the European Union, with what is insecure. But this is not the entire story. So this kind of narrative that Italy has been using over the years is an internal meaning a within EU narrative. In particular, Italy has tried to emphasize that persons which are arriving in Italy are in fact arriving in the European Union. So we have to underline solidarity in the European Union project. That has been very, very important. It has been there for many times since the refugee crisis, and Italy has stressed this point a lot, maintaining that if we do not have solidarity, which by the way is one of the fundamental traits of the European Union, the ontological security of the European Union is going to be impaired. And these kind of narratives have been emphasized by all the ministers that I've just mentioned. Just to make some examples, Italy has time and again emphasized the need to relocate asylum seekers that were arriving in Italy. Later on, it has emphasized the necessity to update the profiles of the persons which were arriving and that were to be relocated in the member states of the European Union. And most importantly, there has been a strong emphasis on showing solidarity on search and rescue operation in the Mediterranean, something which has not been done to this moment at the European Union level. Which are the implications of this narrative, and what is the main impact of this lack of solidarity on the side of the other member states of the European Union? There are in fact a lot of implications that are building other important borders, be they rigid or more fluid, but still borders nonetheless. So for example, when Italy was not able to face the increasing inflows that was very, very clear in 2016, there was a very prominent and sudden rush to Libya. That was the summer of 2017 when Minister Minniti, working on previous agreement with Libya, has basically agreed on a memorandum of understanding with Libya on the training of the border guard and the support of the country to somehow prevent departures towards Italy. Not only that, this kind of lack of solidarity, which has been shown by the other member states of the European Union, has probably been very, very important in the signature of the code of conduct on the NGOs that we have seen has been signed by Minister Minniti. More than once, Minister Minniti went to the European tables to Frontex asking for sharing of responsibility, of rotation of ports, of disembarkments, with no reply. So this kind of neglect was followed by the decision to sign the code of conduct to manage what was called as a jungle in the Mediterranean. This kind of narration was also present with Minister Salvini, so with the second government that I have examined. The argument was the same. We want solidarity. We are the border of the European Union, but the rhetoric that was used by Minister Salvini was much more harsher than it was with Minister Minniti. So Minister Salvini threatened the European Union to close Italian ports to the vessels of the international missions, such as, for example, the mission UNAFOR Sophia. But the final objective was not the discontinuation of this operation, but just to force hands and to show that we need solidarity from the European Union. However, as we all know, this kind of very harsh rhetoric with respect to the European Union and the tensions that were very clear at that period in times with the European Union have led to the dismissal of Operation UNAFMED Sophia, and the lack of any kind of operation in the Mediterranean, as we are seeing now. So Operation Irini, which has overtaken that kind of operation, has not a focus on migration. So actually there is nothing existing in the Mediterranean which is dealing with migration. The last government, so the closest to us, was the one which has experienced a bit of solidarity from the European Union. That was the moment when in 2019, Minister Lamorgese was able to obtain something at the European Union level. So there was this decision by the Commission on a kind of redistribution of the ports of disembarkation, so a rotation, after the first security and health checks, which were, however, to be implemented in Italy. Which were the drawbacks? The system was running on a voluntary basis, and there were only few of the member states of the European Union which were really contributing. The situation has worsened a lot with the COVID pandemic, to the point that this last event, which was very promising, the Malta summit of 2019, was stopped. So Italy was caught with a lot of migrants which were resuming in arrivals, and the COVID pandemic. So you may understand that the measures that Italy had to take at that time were particularly hard. There was social distancing to be respected. Flows were increasing in Italy. The prefects were not able to receive any more migrants. So eventually that created a very peculiar kind of border in the quarantine vessels that we are seeing now, because they are still running offshore Sicily, so just off the Sicilian coast. So let's shift to the second narrative that has been very consistent along the Italian government, starting from 2015. The second narrative says that the European Union has to stretch its external borders to Africa. There were a lot of argumentations about the Minister the Interior that, in fact, the European Union has to be much more proactive in Africa, because it is there, exactly there, that a lot of challenges for the European Union are arising, starting from security to demography to resources to climate change and, of course, migration. So, of course, this kind of argument is somehow conflating the migration dimension with the foreign policy dimension, which is kind of overlapping between the issue areas. And it is very prominent to recall that Italy had a major role in this peculiar inclination towards Africa by the European Union. Indeed, Italy was strongly emphasizing the necessity to stretch the European Union borders at the south border of Libya. And that was emphasized more than once and implemented actually by Minister Minniti with the memorandum that was referring to before. And the main argument that was made is that Libyan instability, Libyan insecurity is what is producing and what is nurturing the pockets of smugglers, which are boarding migrants, which are then losing their lives in the Mediterranean. So in order to prevent this security challenge, we need to train the border guard of Libya, and we have to prevent departures. Otherwise, they're going to die in the Mediterranean. So this kind of narrative has been taken forward by all the governments, with many implications that you all know. There was a definition of Libya as a safe country, with all the doubts and the questions that this brings with it. There was an increase in talks with African countries, Chad, Mali, Niger, and others. And there has been a kind of neglect of migrants as main subjects, in particular when we are referring to the populist government. Let's see the very last narrative that Italy has been very consistent in producing. Here, there is this kind of understanding that migration is somehow defining who we are, in particular, according to which are the values and which are the integration possibilities that we are giving these migrants that are arriving or just that are simply asking for asylum. Here, of course, differences are more pronounced among the political formations, even though there are some ambiguities also when it comes to the center-left coalitions in Italy. But indeed, there is a very clear neglection of the institution of asylum, which has been shown by the populist formation. We can just recall the security decrees, the abstention from the Global Compact for Migration, as Professor McQueen will be discussed later. And there has been a kind of consideration of asylum as a draining of resources from what are the real objectives and the real necessity that Italy needs. Of course, this has the important consequences in terms of migrants' rights, the asylum as an important institution in Italy, and we all know that asylum as a very unconstitutional importance in Italy, and has indeed also somehow impinged not only on Italy as a country, a receiving country, a country which is hosting migrants which are arriving in the European Union, but has had also an impact on the European Union itself. So the abstention of Italy from the Global Compact for Migration was perceived as astonishing. With Italy, only the Visegrad countries and Austria have not voted the Global Compact for Migration. And Italy was the only country in the Mediterranean not to have signed this kind of compact, which, by the way, was not mandatory in any way, but was enough to send a very clear message to the European Union and to the entire international community that Italy was not that open as it was before. So that was basically what I wanted to say, and that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Mark McQueen. Which one is yours? I don't know. This one, maybe that one, yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
So,
sorry.
Just so everybody knows who you are, Mark McQueen is a researcher and lecturer in development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and he has 20 minutes.
Thank you. No, thank you so much for inviting me. Most beautiful place I've ever been for a conference. Small story, this is really a work in progress. I'd started this pre-COVID, and then I was asked by Maciel Santos, Professor Santos at the Centre of African Studies in Porto, to work with him on African trade unions. And long story short, I guest edited a special edition of a journal on African trade unions, which was published on Tuesday, and never again. It's like, those people who might have done this, if you haven't, don't. I've done it for you, just don't do it. It was, you know, everything happened on that. So I've only just got back to this, is my story, you know. People joined us, people left us, mostly left us. I don't know what I said, what I did, but that's finished now. So I've got back to this, and in the meantime, getting back to this, the British government's capacity to do something outrageous just never dies. They started off this Rwanda scheme, and I thought, this is so outrageous. I have got to research this because it's important, it's outrageous. So I moved to looking at this scheme. So that's why the focus has slightly changed from the one that I sent to Francesca earlier. And essentially it picks up on the excellent keynote speech and other great speeches, including the last one. How do we see people in the end? In a neoliberal world, if we believe in neoliberalism, I don't, but if we do, then we are at heart economistic beings. We're rational, logical, profit maximizers. That's what we are. And that's the way the British government is framing this scheme. So it sounds a bit philosophical. It isn't really, it's quite empirical. But in the end, they're saying, look, people are logical, rational, profit maximizers. We're going to cut off the people smugglers' business plan. If they can't see any profit in it, they won't take these people across the Mediterranean. That's their be all and end all. So is that a simplistic narrative? And the corollary of that, of course, is the people themselves that are coming from Africa. I'm an Africanist. The people that come from Africa, if they can't see any profit in coming, they won't come. That's a classic, neoliberal view. The only reason they come is to make money. We all exist in an economic world. So I think that's a dangerous and simplistic view on both sides. And that's what I'm hoping to pick apart with this research as it goes. Brief stats, and of course the stats are, immediately out of date because of the terrible situation in Ukraine. But they need to be looked at. So approximately how I wanted to look at, obviously I'm looking at African migrants across the Mediterranean, but I wanted to sort of see how they fit into a general picture. And until Ukraine crisis, it's been the numbers of people coming, the numbers of people who are migrants globally have been increasing in absolute numbers, but as a percentage of population, fairly steady. About 3.5% of this world is a migrant, which is a lot. People don't feel comfortable enough in their own country. But that's going to change markedly, of course, with the situation in Ukraine. So what is it about? At the moment, about 3.5% of all the world's female population is migrant and 3.7% of the world's male population is migrant. And perhaps the saddest figure that I want to work with is the bottom one. 3,900 migrants are missing, dead around this world, which is a terrible figure to have to contemplate. And I want to look at African migrants. Where do people go? Perhaps unsurprisingly, most people are going to Europe. If you look at the blue lines, the latest figure, 2020, the majority of migrants want to come to Europe, with Asia close on its heels. And I'm studying the migrants that are coming to Britain. Is Britain worth studying? Well, yeah, quantitatively, it's the 5th highest country that people want to come to. Again, I think this figure will be immediately outdated because Russia is the 4th highest country. I think that's going to drop considerably in the next round of statistics. So Britain is statistically worth studying as a country that migrants want to come to. Most people, unsurprisingly, still want to go to the USA, Germany, KSA, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Russia, and then the UK. So it's statistically a significant place. Where are they coming from? My problem really is making this significant, because if you look at the top 20 people on the move, not happy enough in their own countries, very few of them are Africa at the top. There's only Egypt, which is a very particular North African country, and of course with a lot of European and other mixtures to it. So I'm going to have to work hard perhaps to make this more valid. Why would you study Africa when most people on the move are from India, Mexico, Russia, China, etc. And my next point, I've taken South Sudan and I've taken Nigeria as countries of study. And that's because if you look at the percentages of the population, you can see, tragically perhaps, South Sudan has got the most immigrants in the world. Almost a quarter of their population is left, which is staggering, really. A quarter of the British population left. So that's a staggering figure in red of the amount of people leaving. And a lot of very sad figures for Africa, really. When you look at that red column, the percentage of population that's actually leaving, it's massive amounts. That really is having a big effect. And sadly, a large number of those are highly educated people. So there's a massive brain drain. It's not just a number, it's the human capital involved. So very sad figures. Nigeria, you can see that really in terms of percentage of their population that's on the move, it's not statistically significant, but this is a practical matter, and I think probably has come to us all. If you apply for funding for any research on Africa, you really have to name some of the big countries, otherwise you're not going to get it. If you don't put South Africa, if you don't put Nigeria, if you don't put Kenya, they're not going to look at you. So I don't mean that I'm doing it cynically in that sense. It's just a reality that Africa, for most funding bodies, not that important unless you're prepared to commit to one of the bigger countries. So that's why I've gone for South Sudan and for Nigeria. And finally, just to emphasize, that Africa's population has changed the most because of migration. You can see up there, the latest figures in the light blue, it's almost 15% shift in Africa's population over 5 years, which is, staggering, really, huge amount of change. I thought Europe's population change would have been bigger. It's way down the list. We're not changing much. Well, sorry, if we're European, I am European. Yeah, down the bottom, it hasn't changed much. I think obviously that's going to change with the Ukraine situation. So, having tried to set myself up with some statistical validity for the research, and then I was going for empirical studies. I was going to go South Sudan, Republic of Sudan, because I used to work in the Republic of Sudan. I had familiarity with it, but I think I'll just go for South Sudan and Nigeria now to make it simpler. And my thought is, okay, so the British government's taken a transactional model of aid, which I'll come to, a business model of aid. We're going to cut off the business, the economic reason for you to want to take these smugglers, and we're going to take away the economic reason for you to want to come to Europe anyway. That will do it. But really, I thought, let's have a look at the pull and push reasons. Why do people come to the UK? I don't think these are very surprising. I guess most of these would be the same for Italy, for the USA, because they get low pay, their working and living conditions are poor, they're overloaded with precarious work, lack of job satisfaction, they're caught up in violent countries with civil and international conflict, and they feel discriminated against on the grounds of gender or race or religion. So these have been around a long time, but this is what's pushing people out of Africa to want to come to a country like the UK. What's pulling them in? Classic migration pull factors. Yeah, we're an aging population in Britain, for sure, as in most of Europe now. So we need workers, despite what's the polite word for bullshit? The stuff that Johnson says that we don't want migrants, but we actually do need migrants. As the vast majority of service jobs now is struggling to fill them now that we've left the EU. So we need workers, relatively high salaries compared to Africa. The colonial link, colonialism keeps its ugly head going, that many of these people do speak English, and there is a kind of path dependency. They come from systems, social systems, education, health, which still have a colonial impact to them. So Britain's quite familiar to them in terms of the systems they go into. Often they've got family here, so they've got someone to help them settle. Social security maybe doesn't exist at home, so the chance to get pensions, that's useful for them. Education and healthcare is here, although nearly all my African friends bemoan the fact that we don't have enough discipline in our schools, and their schools are much more disciplined, but still. And there's a perception that Britain's a meritocracy, and is a very transparent country. I try to tell them that if you look at the Prime Minister and all the members of Parliament in the ruling class, that they all come from the same extremely rich private schools and went to the same universities, Oxford and Cambridge, but they don't believe me. They still say to me that if you want to make it, you can, but you can't at home. So working around those factors and looking at this through a neoliberal lens, this is the situation in South Sudan, which I think is particularly stark. There's massive destruction of crops, theft of livestock. People don't work the land anymore because it's mined, there's landmines, there's fighting on it. Most of the economy is a war economy. There's so many people, as we saw, they've lost 25% of their population. Any foreign businesses have left. Why would you invest in a country that's volatile? With the result that, 6 million people are at crisis level food insecurity, not starving, but just chronically undernourished. 4 million people have been displaced. 8 million people use humanitarian assistance. And through a neoliberal lens, you really think that by saying that we're going to send people to Rwanda rather than you're going to stay in a camp in London, you really think that that's going to stop people suffering like this coming? You know, you've got to question that. I mean, are you serious? This is the situation people are in, and you say, oh, they're not going to come anymore because they think they're going to be sent from, as soon as they arrive in Britain, we'll send them to Rwanda. That's going to stop them. I really, really don't think so when you look at that situation. And if you look at Nigeria, a lot of social psychological trauma there, high levels of war, poverty, domestic violence, rape, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, huge amounts of trauma, people desperate to escape this when they can't get treatment for it. I don't want to generalize Nigeria, of course. A lot of this is localized trouble, ethnic problems in the southeast, and particularly in the north and the northeast with the war with Boko Haram, banditry and kidnappings. See a Boko Haram bombing of a college in Kano. And so again, my sort of research is going to be based around the fact that I think the British idea that people who've suffered this are not going to want to come because they're going to be transferred to Rwanda is seriously misguided. And so I also want to frame it through these very different directions, which the previous presentation looked at really well. And it really is such different directions that countries are going in and the world is going in. And for me, Britain's position is not a good one, but I know that's a normative statement, and I'll flesh that out. So I'll flesh that out when we look at this infamous camp where Australia sent migrants to. They offshored them, sent them to Papua New Guinea to this camp, which became known for violence, for self-harm, for suicide. And the Papua New Guinea government took it into their own hands in the end to close this camp. The Supreme Court said, we don't care, you're using this as an instance of extraterritoriality. You're saying this is Australia on our land. We're telling you this is our land, this is Papua New Guinea, this is a disgrace and we're closing it. So I'm not saying it would be as extreme as that in Rwanda, but the British government needs to think about that. If you're offshoring people to be processed in Rwanda, this is a foreign territory. If they suddenly get tired of this, or the British, or they think that the British are not treating them well before they're sending them, they can close it down. So you've got to think about how much control that you're having over these processes. And that's important because this simplistic narrative that the Johnson government gives is that they're repeating the Brexit narrative. We're taking control of migration. While we were in the EU, we had to do the stupid policies of the EU. Now we're taking control of migration, but you're not. We're sending them to a foreign country, and that's a strong foreign country, actually. With a strong leader, Paul Kagame is one of the longest leading people in power in the world, not just Africa. So this could come back to bite you. And also want to have a look, perhaps, at a lot of civil society groups in Britain are looking at Italy's Zampa law as being a real model of a law. I think Italy is the only country in the EU that has, through this Zampa law, a fully worked out way of looking after unaccompanied children that come in migration now. And I think it is very impressive law as to what should happen to them, what shouldn't happen to them, how they should be treated, how they should not be treated. And trying to get mentors for them. As a picture, I think this is actually from Sicily, where you have responsible people mentoring and helping them with their lives with a view to fostering them as well. So there's a big sort of battle with civil society groups in Britain saying we need this in Britain, and a government taking a very different direction. So to flesh out the two sort of sides I want to see fighting about this, I'm hoping I'll take a Gramscian perspective on this. Gramsci my Italian is so bad. What is it? War of position? Guerra di posizione. That there is, I'm very fond of this phrase, and I should say it better in Italian. Gramsci famously said there's a war of position. Civil society needs to fight. Needs to fight bad things by governments. So this is the sort of core principles of humanitarian set out by Henri Dunant in 1863, that we should be humane, and neutral, and impartial, and independent. The Grand Bargain, which is the reinvigoration of looking after humanitarians, set out in the 2016 World Summit. These are all good things, I think. A lot more respect for migrants now, recognizing their mental health problems, recognizing they may have gender-based problems. And we have a comprehensive now migration framework and refugees response framework, setting out good things that all countries should do. But on the other hand, the battle that's going on, the war of position, is that a lot of countries are taking a securitization agenda. We're not giving aid to poor countries. We're giving aid to countries like Turkey, Serbia, Egypt, who are going to spend that money on keeping migrants out rather than spending it on poor countries. Even the criminalization of humanitarians now, which I think is quite shocking. Spanish firefighters were accused of people smuggling for pulling people out of the sea and taking them to Greece, found not guilty, but why did they even go to court? French farmer arrested several times on the Italian-French border for helping people who came to his olive farm half dead, and he helped them and gave them a lift across the border and was arrested and fined. So two very different sides of this migration debate, and it needs to be fought over for sure. And to end very briefly with Britain and Rwanda, from the 1st of January this year, if you arrive illegally, they say, you can be flown to Rwanda, no limit on the numbers, as many as we want. Eventually, we'll give you long-term accommodation. And Johnson's framed this as a migration management tool, neoliberal discourse, breaking the business model. I thought, what the hell does Rwanda get out of this? They get 120 million quid out from Britain for this. We're paying them 120 million. We'll pay their operational costs, accommodation costs, and integration expenses. It's a transactional approach. I think it's a mistake, not looking after people. I think it will come back to bite us. Other countries have been encouraged, Denmark and Austria, to try it. In Australia, they tried it. It was nasty. The Papua New Guinea government closed it down, said it was violent, said it was nasty. So I think it's a very complex and multifaceted issue, migration. I think the idea of the war of position of Gramsci is good. We need to fight this, and we need to fight for those compact migration. We need to fight for the things like the sample law. Otherwise, the British government's going in the opposite direction. And I think that's very, very dangerous. So it's a battle. It's a battle to be won. British government's on one side. I'd like to think I'm on the other side. But it's always up for grabs, for sure.
Okay, thank you. Qual è il vostro? Questo qui. Okay, the next, are you going to be speaking alone? Okay. Alice Lachey, Cristina Dallara, and Deborah Mantovani who are doctoral candidate at the Department of Political and Social Science. Cristina Dallara is an associate professor in political science, and Deborah Mantovani is an associate professor in sociology, all in the same department of the University of Bologna. And this is Alice, and she has the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to the organizers. Today, we will present an article we are writing together with Deborah and Cristina on asylum adjudication in Italy, and in particular on a peculiar stage of the asylum procedure, which is the appeal stage. When asylum seekers ask for protection, their application has been decided, is analyzed at first stage by administrative bodies belonging to the Ministry of the Interior, which are called territorial commissions. But then, if they receive a partial or total negative decision, they can appeal, they can challenge the decision of the territorial commission in front of a judge in civil courts. So our article is focusing specifically on this stage. Judges can decide to grant different types of protections, some regulated at EU level, and one protection, which is called humanitarian protection, and now it is changed, it is called special protection, which is regulated at the national level. And our article focuses only on this type of protection. according to the method, so our main aim is to understand if the integration of asylum seekers can have an impact on the recognition of humanitarian protection. And in doing so, we started to, we adopt a mixed method approach. So we started with a quantitative analysis of 670 asylum decisions adjusted by one civil court. We know that this is a big limit of our research. However, we tried to overcome this limit thanks to a qualitative analysis. In particular, we did observation during hearings in 5 civil courts, and also some structured interviews to judges working in 6 civil courts. So our dependent variable for the quantitative analysis is the final decision of the judge, and we divide the final decisions in rejected or accepted with humanitarian protection. And then we, after a reading of the decisions, we divided the decisions according to the motivation. And we found 4 different motivations written by the judges in the sentences, in the decisions. The violence in the country of origin, the violence in the country of transit, the personal weaknesses. When we refer to personal weaknesses, we refer to health problems, or in case of people with young age, in young age, and uprooting. So the fact that people don't have ties in their country of origin, but they are well integrated in the Italian country, where they have work, or they have a family here. You can find also the percentage of decisions having this kind of motivation. The variables we collected concern socio-demographic characteristics of asylum seekers, migratory experience, and the dimension of the integration, which are the variables we are more interested in. In particular, we collected data on linguistic integration of asylum seekers, social integration, so if they participate to social activities, for example, volunteering, professional integrations, if they attended some vocational training courses, job experience, if they have worked in the past, and family integration, if they have a family in Italy or in their country of origin. So I will briefly show the descriptive results. If you notice here, you can find the data on male and females. We have a very small females in our sample, and for this reason we decided not to consider that in the analysis, the sex in the analysis. Here you can find some information on the country of origin of asylum seekers and on the migratory experience. Concerning the migratory experience, we would like to understand if time can have an impact in the integration of the integration pattern of asylum seekers. However, this has not be possible because because 2 main reasons. One, because the variance in time from the arrival in Italy and the final decision is not so consistent, and also because we don't have enough information on when these activities have been done by asylum seekers. And in particular, we don't have information on the integration activities from the arrival to the first instance decision. And then we collect also data on if or not the asylum seekers are hosted in some reception centers. Yes, this is okay. for what concerns the results of the logistic regression model, we can say that in the first column you can find the results of all the decisions. Here you find that all the dimensions of integration are relevant, seems to impact seems to have a probability to increase the probability of asylum seekers for granting humanitarian protection. In particular, this is particularly true for what concerns the last column, the uprooting, where all the dimensions of integration seems to increase the probability, consistently increase the probability. And in that case, also being in a reception center seems to increase the probability of the asylum seeker to obtain a protection. However, since the results of the logistic regression model are difficult to interpret, we calculated the margins. Here we put all the results in one slide. The scales of probability are different. So we can say that comparing to the model which consider all the decisions without considering the motivation, in case in which the judge considered the violence in the country of origin and the violence in the country of transit, the integration variables seems less relevant, since less relevant in obtaining humanitarian protection. However, the dimension of work is still relevant, as well as the attending or not some professional courses. In personal weaknesses, for what concerning motivations, including personal weaknesses, here we find another interesting element that in this case, the linguistic integration seems to be more important. This is and here the work seems less important, probably because, as we said, in these personal weaknesses, there are people who have health problems, and so this can affect this result. And finally, in the uprooting, you can see that all the dimensions of integration increase the probability of the asylum seekers to obtain humanitarian protection, especially the work dimension here is clear. People who now have a work contract have almost 100% probability of obtaining the humanitarian protection, and also having a family in Italy. As I said, the quantitative analysis has been integrated with a qualitative analysis, which confirmed our quantitative part. In particular, the judges argue that integration is an extremely relevant aspect to be considered for granting humanitarian protection, and that they argue that integration is an extremely complex concept with an interplay of different factors, such as the judge said, such as languages, studies, vocational training courses, work, since they are useful to understand the level of integration. Even if from the interviews, the centrality of work emerged, judges said that this is the first thing that they consider in order to understand if they can grant or not the humanitarian protection, as well as other elements such as family, language, social and professional activities, and they check these characteristics, this level of integration during meetings. For example, one judge said that during meetings, she always asked to asylum seekers to speak Italian in order to understand if they really speak Italian, and since the only exam certificate is not enough. And also during interviews, we had the opportunity to to check that is actually happened. In fact, in all hearings, judges ask for that kind of questions. As also emerged from the quantitative analysis, the reception center seems to have an impact, especially because in reception centers, asylum seekers have the opportunity to attend many language courses, many vocational training courses, and sometimes, for example, during hearings, the asylum seeker present to the judge documentation of all the activities he or she has done in the reception center, and this is well evaluated well considered by the judge. However, as also our quantitative part shows the integration related issues seems less relevant in cases of vulnerabilities, in case of violence in the country of origin or violence in the country of transit, for example, violence is in Libya. And also this can explain the higher results, the higher acceptance rates of certain nationalities, which also emerge from our quantitative part. This is, for example, the case of Bangladesh. Judges said that in case of Bangladesh, they have both some personal, some vulnerabilities concerning the violence in the country of origin, as well as the integration. The integration, because usually they have a work contract. However, judges said that they have not the possibilities to check if they are false or not, but they doubt on the veracity of these kind of documents. However, they cannot check it. Finally, although in our quantitative analysis the dimension of time has not be considered, during interviews the element of time emerged. In particular, judges said that because of the long delays in asylum adjudication procedures in Italy, people obviously are integrated because they stay here waiting for the decision for more than 4 or 5 years. And so judges said that, for example, this judge argued these people are, who have lived here in Italy for many years and at the mercy of our decisions. It makes me think that it is not right to return them after so much time, especially because here many have now integrated here. So they argue that now they are integrated, they build their life in Italy and they cannot return them. Finally, yes, we are aware of the many limits of our research concerning especially the quantitative analysis. However, we would like to integrate it, also considering the different decisions made in different courts. And also we would like to understand better the role of structural conditions, structural elements that can favor the integration of asylum seekers, especially in the reception center. And we would like to start from the decisions we have already analyzed in order to check in which kind of a reception center asylum seekers were located, and in particular if they were located in the so-called CAS emergency centers or the so-called SAI, which are reception centers ruled by the local government, the municipalities. Since according to the literature on asylum reception systems, in the first one, the emergency centers, asylum seekers can access less opportunities, integration opportunities. For example, there are not language courses, there are not other kind of, for example, professional courses.
Thank you, Alice, especially for having So that's the first three papers of the afternoon session, and now we have Q&A. I have a few questions, but they're not that crucial, so I'll just leave them or just not say them at all if there are other questions from the other participants. So ask away.
I just have a question for Mark. I agree, and I really appreciated your paper. I think it was really interesting, and I agree that this rwanda scheme is not only a bad idea, but something that is not going to work, because as you said, probably low paid, unemployment are not and push factors that can explain alone migration. But I was, since I've studied the case of Tunisia, I was wondering if the British government has ever thought of giving more aid to those countries in which, you know, migration takes place the most, like Italy helped Tunisia, because Tunisian migrants were in the last 5 years among the most numerous migrants from Northern Africa. So I was wondering if you found that this parallel or not. Thank you.
So I have two questions. The first one for Professor Ciccurulli, which is there. Okay, I will be able to see you. Thank you very much for all your presentation. Were really interesting, but particularly on yours, since I'm working also on bordering studies, I was wondering if you have considered, or if you can answer, or maybe include in your presentation, give us a little bit more insight in the role of European Union identity construction process, since I'm not in the video. Okay. Since, as you all may know, also a big problem about this mismatch between the national borders and the borders of Europe has to do also because of this dishomogeneity within the European Union, because it is born as an economic agreement. So I was wondering, which is the role that has not Italy, but also Europe in its in this mismatch and in these different narratives of Italy, of bordering Europe through Italy. That's one of my questions. And second, to Alicia, thank you very much. It was really interesting. We have already a little bit spoken about your research, which I find really interesting. My question will be, have you considered, or if not, I think you have considered it, because we spoke a little bit more during your time now doing the fieldwork, about the judges, the role of judges in the acceptance or not, because of course migrants or asylum seekers have a role because of their integration and so on, or their level of language, Italian and so on, but which is the variable, have you considered the variable of the judges' own experiences, first in asylum seeker courts, because as you told me, actually many judges have the experience in this specific field, which is of course maybe a variable that can influence also the acceptance or not. And so the personal education, this kind of policy, and also the experience of the judge. And then a secondary question about the language integration, because you said also that language was one of the main variables considered also by judges. And I wondered, it is because most of the judges do not have maybe the linguistic preparation to understand properly the history of asylum seekers, because maybe the translation is not good enough, or the translators are not there. I know that there is also the case of this. So this will be my two questions.
Other questions? But Want to ask a question or you want to?
And then I stay here because I have to.
Yes.
So my question goes to Mark. It was just a curiosity. I was wondering whether the Rwanda scheme is also applicable to those which are asking asylum in the UK, and if yes, if that implies that Rwanda is recognized as a safe third country in the UK. I heard that perhaps this kind of scheme was stopped by the court, a kind of court, and if yes, which are the reasons why this has been done? And also, you were talking about a neoliberal mentality that the UK is showing, but I was wondering whether it is not only about neoliberal mentality, but also liberal, not at all liberal mentality, because if you look at the situation of Ukrainian refugees and the way in which they have hampered to arrive in the UK, that seems that the UK is having a completely non-liberal approach to the migration issue or in general.
Any other questions? I also have just a few for Michela, but similar to the other question. I mean, because you framed it in terms of the Italian narrative, which of course has different flavors because the ministers have changed. And I was shocked yesterday, it doesn't seem to be pertinent, but they were talking about the 70 years or whatever of Elizabeth II's reign, and she's known 14 prime ministers during this time. My reaction was only 14, because there are dozens in the same period in Italy. But my question is, okay, but it's not that unreasonable in terms of overall narrative. The implications, its operationalization is. So I think it would be interesting, this is not necessarily a question you have to answer, but what are the counter narratives? Not only from Europe, but because we always speak about Europe, it's a single entity, but there are probably lots of them. I think that would be interesting. For Mark, I just wanted a comment really, because I subscribe to everything you said, but I have just one depressing comment, is that I understand that the extraterritorial aspect and why that might be a hindrance for the actual implementation of this policy, but it also seems like a very effective way of having everything occur on site. I mean, it's the one that is probably, if this does actually come to fruition, if it's actually implemented, I really doubt we're going to have any idea about what really goes on, and that may be one of the reasons that the policy has been imagined. Finally, on Egypt, I also had a question about the linguistic integration aspect, because you spoke about the migratory experience variables which weren't in the regression models. But from a certain point of view, it seems like, well, linguistic integration, other things being equal, would be directly proportional to how long these asylum seekers have been waiting. And maybe it's not so much a question of integration, but it's also a question, one of the judges said it explicitly, sort of compensation or pity towards these people who've been waiting for so long. So maybe it's not integration, or in any case, there's this additional aspect. Okay, since Michaela is already here.
Okay, so thank you for the comments and the suggestions. With respect to the role of the EU in the construction of the narratives that Italy has, it's a very pertinent question. And in fact, the title of the paper is the constitutive borders, because this is of course an iteration process. And in fact, my task in the paper was just to examine the contribution of Italy, but of course the EU contribution has been fundamental. So we all know the history of Italy. Italy has been a late comer, not only in terms of immigration, but also in terms of laws. So we are still missing a lot. There are some points that have been directly taken from the European Union, such as all the asylum packet. So in this sense, Italy is strongly affected by the European Union in this precise construction. And Schengen too. So as we all know, Italy was not invited to join the club, even though it was a founding members of the European Union. So it was the only country which was not invited for obvious reasons, because it was not considered to be reliable in stopping migration. And so in this sense, it is a receiver of the EU legislation. And the Dublin regulation is, of course, one of the most important examples, even though we were signing the Dublin regulation in the past. It was a very different scenario at that time, but still. Okay, as for counter narratives, you are right. I probably don't have the time to reflect on this, but this is a very important suggestion. I tried in the paper to put some of the nuances between the political colors, which are there, which are present. And so I made sure to remark the differences between some positions with respect to others. So for example, in the center left, there has been always an emphasis on human rights and the necessity to save the lives of migrants. This does not mean that these governments have not been accused of human rights violation, but still, I think it is very important that this is present in the narrative and in rhetoric that is made. As well, we can say that Salvini was not entirely what he tried to sell to the external world. He has inaugurated new humanitarian corridors, for example, with Ethiopia. So in this sense, he was going along the decisions that were previously taken, but in the rhetoric that was not present. So there was a kind of a mismatch, but I will think thoroughly at your question. Thank you.
Mark?
Yeah, all great questions. I'm not being polite, British. They're all great questions, and they all get to the heart of the matter. Francesca absolutely gets to the heart of the matter. This is not cohesive policy. It's not well thought through. Yes, if you're going to use a country as a place to offshore or externalize your aid, you need to have a closer relationship with them and understand them, and Britain hasn't. And in fact, what's embarrassing for Britain is that last year aid to Rwanda was blocked on the grounds of their human rights violations, which is hugely embarrassing that you now feel it's an appropriate country to send people to. So you're absolutely right. This is, unless they make a more cohesive policy around this, they will have to do a massive U-turn to support, to give aid to Rwanda now, and have to find a justification for rearranging what they said when 1 year ago you said that this was a country unfit to give aid to because of its human rights violations. So not well thought through, and particularly because in the bigger picture, yeah, Britain has signed up for this fragile states initiative that all major countries have, that we should try to stop migration at origin. We should identify the most fragile states in the world, have objective criteria for classifying them as fragile, and then on the basis of that classification, give aid at source to them to stop that fragility so they won't want to come. So Britain has signed up for all these things rhetorically, but then in terms of its policy, it's not acting upon them. Yeah, it's a very difficult one, because I think Rwanda, of course, I think it's fair to say it's an authoritarian developmental state. They've done some very good policies in an authoritarian way. They're famous for their environment policies. Kigali is one of the cleanest cities in the world. Woe betide anyone who throws rubbish in Kigali. So it's got a very good environmental policy. It's attracted Volkswagen, of course. Volkswagen could have gone anywhere in Africa. They went to Kigali because they thought there would be a well-trained, decent workforce there. So they wouldn't do that lightly. I mean, Volkswagen no way is going to go to a country where they feel it's not wouldn't have a workforce to work. They've done good policies of bringing together Hutu and Tutsis post-genocide. That all schools must be mixed. If you want to get a business loan, you can get an interest-free loan if it's a Hutu and a Tutsi together. If it's two Hutu or two Tutsi, you have to pay the usual interest rate. So I think, in an authoritarian way, they've done a lot of good policies. But the fact that Britain feels that their human rights violations are so bad we can't give them aid, but we can send our migrants to them. Yeah, I think someone needs to think that one through. So you're right to the heart of it, I think, with that question. What?
From a certain point of view, it's an incentive to not go.
Actually, to come to your question, I strongly agree with that. I think the British government thinks that we can play this, that it will reduce numbers because we'll get some of them on the planes and it will go out of sight. And then what happens over there, people are not that bothered about it. As long as we don't see lots of boats coming across, landing at Dover and on the south coast of Britain. So I think you're very right on that point. And I think that's something they can't possibly say diplomatically, but it's surely discussed at every meeting. So yeah, absolutely. What the lawyers have said in response to that, which also comes to your point, Mikhail, what the lawyers have said is that what's going to happen is that lawyers are going to complain about the fact that that person should not have been sent to Rwanda because it turns out that they've got relatives in Britain. So if someone's got relatives in Britain, they should be allowed to stay with them while their case is being processed. So that's going to happen. Then you're going to get people flown back, and then the British government will argue about it and flown back, and it will become an expensive embarrassment of people flying around the world when they should have just been with their cousin, uncle, grandfather who's lived in Manchester or London for years. So certainly that's going to happen. They've also said, of course, that you shouldn't send any people classed as vulnerable of mental health issues or people that have suffered assaults. And of course, you can't send minors. So you're going to have, the judges have also argued, coming to your point, Mikhail, that this is going to be a problematic because people don't know or won't have documentation on their ages. So you're going to send someone to Rwanda on the basis that they're 18. Turns out later they're 16. And they're going to be flown back, and then there'll be another argument about it. Another passport will appear saying they're 19. It's going to be an utter chaotic nightmare of legalistic debates. And in the meantime, these poor people are going to be flying back and forwards between Kigali and London. It's outrageous, really. So yeah, I think what coming to your point more broadly, Mikhail, that it's not been stopped, but judges have said we're going to challenge this on a number of grounds. And one of the main grounds is that Britain is abrogating its responsibilities under international law. You've signed the Global Migration Pact, you've signed the Global Compact. You have responsibilities. You think just because you left the EU, you can do anything you want now. You can't. This is a flagrant violation of migration agreements and laws. And Priti Patel, who, she's a strong person, I would leave it at that. She said, no, you can, she uses some certain rude words, you can take that. And that's not true. You may think it's against the spirit of the law. It's not against the letter of the law. They will receive due process in Kigali in the same way they would have received due process in London. Just coming back to that extraterritorial thing. So there's nothing wrong with doing it there, she said. They'll receive exactly the same treatment, the same consideration in Kigali as they would have done in London. So it might be against the spirit because they came and wanted to stay on British territory and now they're in the Great Lakes region of Africa. It might be against the spirit, it's not actually against the law. So, judges, you can take it and I'll fight you all the way you want to fight that one, she said. And I think your last point, is a good one also. I mean, yeah, technically speaking, if Britain was following a neoliberal line, there is no way to take, Ukrainian refugees are only a cost in their view. But they did take that view at first. We were very slow. We took a low number of people. And there were huge complaints that there was no British consular support, either in Kiev or in any British ports of entry. So Ukrainians arrived, traumatized, shocked, and there was no support for them, no information leaflets, not even in English, never mind in Ukrainian. There was no places telling them where to go, no buses to just take them to but the difference was there's quite an established Ukrainian community in Britain. They were furious. And these are, you know, second and third generation Ukrainians. They complain bitterly and articulately to the government. This is disgraceful. And of course, this is a wider story we haven't got time for, but there was a general sympathy for them in Britain, you know, in the way that there wasn't for Afghans or people like that. So it was, yeah, you know, what are you doing, government? Whereas when Afghans complained like that, it was like, yeah. But with Ukrainians, so in other words, it did force the government to change. But you're right, if in a true neoliberal sense, you would have just said, well, no, well, why should we? We're not spending money on leaflets. We're not getting translations of things into Ukrainian. We're not putting buses on. So yeah, technically, it's not. It's going against neoliberalism. Yeah, but all excellent, all things that I need to consider and work on. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. The questions of Veronica on experience of judges. In the case of the quantitative analysis we made, we couldn't consider that because they were very few. Like in each court section in Italy, work very few judges. In the court we selected, they are 7. So it is like, but if I consider the also the observation I made in different courts, I can say that, for example, judges who worked before in labor proceedings, they are more sensitive on checking the veracity of the documents, of the working contracts, or they consider more the fact that people work irregularly in the country, but in a positive way. So they said, we know that lots of people in Italy, also Italians, work irregularly in the country. So we consider also irregular work as an index of integration, even if it is not enough alone. If, for example, in cases of judges working in other areas of law, this does not happen. It doesn't happen. For the language, the issue of the language, in Italy we have a very big problem with interpreters. So they are not official and very good interpreters. So lots of time there are many problems of communication during meetings. However, the importance of language is not connected in the integration process, is not so connected to this big problem of interpreters, because judges change language when they speak about things happening in the country of origin for deciding to grant the international protection, so the status, the refugee status and the substantive protection status. And in that case, they try to use the interpreter, even if with big problems. On the contrary, when they speak about the integration in Italy for obtaining information to grant the humanitarian protection, they switch to Italian. So you can find this difference. And yes, clearly the language is strictly connected to time, and so it would be extremely interesting to understand the connection between language, time, and also nationality. For example, during observation, I noticed that there are some national groups who are less likely to speak Italian, even if they are here for a long time. For example, Pakistani people usually don't speak Italian at all, but also people from Bangladesh, they don't speak Italian. However, they usually have work contracts. So judges make some balances between different dimensions For example, they said in the evaluation, they said, okay, these people, this person speaks well Italian, he made lots of courses, however, he has only a contract of 2 weeks. I don't know, it's not an indeterminate contract, it's only a short-term contract, and if you have the other characteristic, the other elements, they can grant humanitarian protection. However, if they, for example, they have long-term contracts, the other dimension seems a little bit less important.
Thank you to our speakers. We have the coffee break now, which it should last 20 minutes. So let's try to be here for 4 p.m. and we will have the second half of the afternoon session. Thank you again to the speakers and thank you.